What if I told you homosexuality was not absent from World War II, but lived in the shadows of its trenches, barracks, and hospitals? The war was fought with tanks, planes, and bombs, but also with silence as soldiers and nurses who loved the wrong way risked exposure, punishment, or worse. Yet letters survive describing hidden romances. Diaries speak of forbidden nights in barracks. Even intelligence files record cases of men and women accused of inappropriate relations. So were these stories rare or more common than history admits? Did homosexuality weaken armies as commanders feared? Or did secret bonds give strength when survival depended on trust? The evidence leaves us with more questions than answers. What do you think, a hidden weakness or a hidden strength? Share in the comments and let me know the time you're watching. And if you want history's most untold truths, subscribing is your choice. But the next revelations only go deeper. The movies show you marching boots, roaring tanks, flags snapping in the wind. But they don't show you what happened in the quiet moments when the spotlight of history turned away. In those silences, soldiers wrote letters. They couldn't send carved names into the wood of their bunks, and sometimes felt things for each other that no general would ever put in a war report. You picture the rows of uniforms, the shouts of drills, the stiff salutes, and beneath all that polish, hidden lives beating just as loudly as the war itself. In every army, men were packed close together. They ate from the same tins, carried each other's gear, and lay shoulder to shoulder in barracks where privacy didn't exist. That closeness bred camaraderie, but sometimes it became something more, something unspoken. Diaries and fragments of testimony show us bonds that didn't fit the manuals, but were too human to deny. British intelligence officer Geoffrey Pike, for instance, later admitted in private papers that the intensity of wartime bonds sometimes blurred into romantic feeling. American poet Robert Duncan, drafted during the war, was dismissed once his homosexuality became known, his uniform taken away, but his story preserved in letters. These aren't rumors. They're pieces of evidence that beneath the thunder of war, desire still found space. The contradiction was sharp. Official rules treated homosexuality as a crime or weakness, punishable by discharge, prison, or worse. Yet military life itself, marching, bunking, surviving together, created environments where closeness was unavoidable. You can imagine the irony. The same institutions demanding loyalty also outlawed the forms of loyalty that grew deepest in secret. Picture a damp barracks at night. Rain hits the roof. The stoves burn low. Blankets barely cover shoulders. You lean against the man beside you for warmth, and maybe a laugh slips out in the dark. It doesn't take much for that comfort to feel like more. What name would you give it if naming it might cost you everything officers worried about: discipline, about maintaining toughness and control? Yet one U.S. Army psychiatrist later admitted that such relationships were far more common than the public will ever know. That sentence alone hints at how wide the gap was between what the rulebook said and what life in the barracks looked like. And that's the reality often missing when we think of W2 in black and white photos. Those soldiers weren't marble heroes. They were flesh and blood people, lonely, frightened, craving warmth. Sometimes, the only place they found it was in each other. You duck inside a long wooden barracks, the kind where bunks are stacked 3 high, and every smell, sweat, leather, damp wool hangs in the air. Privacy doesn't exist here. Dozens of men, share the same space boots clattering on the floorboards, snores echoing in chorus. And when you live like this shoulder to shoulder, day and night, the line between friendship and something more doesn't stay sharp for long. Soldiers wrote later about how bonds formed quickly in these cramped quarters. A man might share his rations, patch up your torn uniform, or help carry your pack when exhaustion hit. Acts like these built trust, and trust in wartime felt electric. For some, it slipped quietly into affection. One U.S. veteran recalled decades later that you had your buddy, and sometimes your buddy was everything. He didn't say more, but maybe he didn't need to. It wasn't just America. British, German, and Soviet soldiers all lived in conditions that forced closeness. Imagine spending weeks in a trench mud creeping into your boots, artillery rumbling overhead, and the only human face you see clearly is the man lying next to you. Is it really surprising that emotions blurred in that constant intensity? Letters and diaries tell pieces of the story. A Canadian soldier in Italy scribbled in his journal about the comfort he felt from one comrade, noting that it kept him steady through the chaos. German archives even include disciplinary cases where men were accused of being too close proof that military police sometimes noticed what was happening in the barracks. Of course, most soldiers never wrote anything down. The risk was too high. Discovery could mean court-martial discharge or worse. So what you're left with are fragments, small windows, into a bigger truth. Like faded handwriting on paper, the words suggest more than they spell out. To get a sense of the tension, think about modern roommates or athletes who spend months traveling together. Even without war, people living in close quarters develop bonds that outsiders may never fully understand. Now, multiply that by fear of death, separation from home, and the constant noise of battle. That intensity forged connections stronger than normal peacetime friendships. And yet, because armies demanded silence, those bonds often remained unnamed. Soldiers might tease, might joke, might hint, but rarely would they say outright what was happening. The barracks became both the place where closeness flourished and the place where it had to stay hidden. You look around that crowded wooden room, helmets hanging from pegs, rifles leaning against the walls, men writing letters by candlelight. The scene looks ordinary, but beneath the surface, unspoken stories ripple everywhere. You step outside the barracks and notice something subtle in the way soldiers talk. Not the shouted commands of officers or the booming songs of marching columns, but the quiet language that slipped between men who shared a secret. In an environment where being discovered could ruin you, words became shields and signals. Queer soldiers learned to navigate conversation with layers. Some used humor, slipping innuendo into jokes that could be brushed off if someone overheard. Others leaned on code words, phrases that seemed ordinary, but carried hidden meaning for those in the know. In the US and Britain slang, like friend of Dorothy, would later become common. But during the war, men often invented their own signals, inside units adjusting them as quickly as the military moved them from one front to another. Gestures worked too. A glance held a second too long, a hand brushing against another in the dark, or even the simple act of sharing a cigarette could signal interest. Imagine the courage it took to make that move, knowing that if you misjudged, you risked ridicule or punishment. One veteran interviewed decades after the war remembered how just sitting slightly closer than necessary could be a gamble, and sometimes the gamble paid off. In cities, things grew more elaborate. Soldiers on leave often sought hidden bars or cafes where coded conversations were the only way to blend in. A well-placed comment about theater art, or even a line from a poem, could open doors. Some servicemen learned quickly which places had reputations for being safe, and once inside, the atmosphere shifted. Uniforms and ranks didn't matter as much. What mattered was finding someone who understood. And then there were letters. Soldiers wrote constantly back home, to family, to friends. For queer soldiers, the challenge was how to express longing without saying too much. Some used poetry cloaking desire in metaphors about stars, seas, or waiting. Others used initials, nicknames, or left whole phrases deliberately vague. When you read those letters now, you can sense the double-layer tender words disguised as simple camaraderie. It's a reminder of how language adapts under pressure. Think of how today people invent emojis, memes, or abbreviations that carry meanings outsiders miss. The principle was the same in 1940s. Army's survival depended on creativity. Standing in the chill of a wartime street, you can almost hear the coded chatter, casual on the surface, alive with hidden meaning underneath. Those words didn't just carry secrets, they carried connection, the lifeline queer soldiers needed in a world that demanded silence. What if I told you that in the middle of bullets flying and shells exploding, some soldiers carried not just rifles, but quiet feelings that frightened them more than enemy fire? On the front lines, longing never disappeared. It marched right alongside fear, loyalty, and hunger. You picture yourself knee-deep in mud, the ground shaking with artillery, and next to you, the only person keeping you steady is the same one you've been sharing cigarettes and secrets with for weeks. Frontline life was brutal. Hours of silence broken by sudden chaos, endless waiting punctuated by sheer terror. In that space, affection became a survival tool. Soldiers leaned on each other, not just physically, but emotionally. A letter from home might lift your spirit, but the squeeze of a hand right there in the trench did even more. Veterans later admitted that the war zone stripped away the usual masks. What mattered was who you trusted, and trust often blurred into something deeper. There are scattered accounts that capture it. An American medic described how the bond with his comrade gave him the strength to carry wounded men under fire. He never called it romance, but when he wrote about how he couldn't bear to lose him, the emotion was clear. A German soldier's diary, found after the war, mentioned how the only comfort in the freezing Russian winter was lying back to back with another man, each guarding the other's warmth and sanity. These stories weren't headlines, but they were lived reality. Fear always hovered. The fear of being shelled, yes, but also the fear of discovery. Armies drilled discipline. Hard same-sex intimacy could mean prison or discharge. So moments of tenderness were often stolen. One's a whispered word in the dark, a shared blanket, a letter passed carefully hand to hand. You can almost feel the tension, the heart racing not just from the battlefield, but from the risk of being seen. And yet, those same risks made the bonds even sharper. Imagine knowing every dawn could be your last. Wouldn't that push you to cling harder to the person beside you? In a strange way, the war intensified everything. Friendships became lifelines. Gestures became declarations and affection, though unspoken, became as vital as ammunition. Think of it like modern firefighters or rescue workers who form unbreakable bonds after facing danger together. But multiply that by months of constant fear, by a world turned upside down. That's what soldiers carried in their hearts. So when you read a battlefield poem scrawled in a notebook, or see two names carved into the stock of a rifle, you realize these weren't just signs of friendship. They were love stories, written right into the mud and blood of the front lines, carried quietly through the smoke of war. You step away from the mud of the trenches and into the corridors of field hospitals, kitchens, and military offices where women served. Their uniforms might have looked crisp, but the lives they lived were just as complicated as the men on the front. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, and factory workers carried their own secrets building attachments in spaces where male eyes rarely wandered. For women, war cracked open doors that peacetime had kept shut. The absence of men on the home front meant women worked together in ways they never had before. Factories buzzed with female crews, welding ships, riveting planes, and packing ammunition. In barracks and offices, women bunked together, ate together, and worked late shifts side by side. Out of this closeness, friendships formed, and sometimes those friendships tipped into something more. Letters and oral histories from the time hint at bonds between nurses in field hospitals who leaned on each other for emotional survival. One American Red Cross nurse recalled how she and her colleague would walk the hospital gardens hand in hand after endless nights tending to wounded soldiers. "We didn't have a name for it," she said decades later, "but we knew it mattered." In Britain, members of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the Army, faced constant rumors about inappropriate behavior. Some officers whispered warnings, while others quietly looked the other way. The truth is that the same cramped conditions that drew men together drew women together too. Imagine rows of narrow cots in a Nissen hut, the cold seeping in through thin walls, and the comfort of warmth found just inches away. And outside, the camp cities under blackout provided cover. In London, Berlin, and New York, women on leave slipped into bars and dance halls, where same-sex couples could move more freely, at least for a few hours. It wasn't safe, but it was possible. Wartime chaos gave people chances to blend in that peacetime order rarely allowed. Famous figures, too, reveal hints of this hidden world. Hilda Matheson, a British intelligence officer and later a broadcaster, was known to have close relationships with women, and her career flourished despite whispers. In America, writers like Willa Cather, though not soldiers, reflected the spirit of women who loved women in a world still reluctant to acknowledge it. These connections show that same-sex bonds weren't rare. They were threaded through every layer of the wartime effort. Think about the irony: war, meant to enforce order, often created cracks where new possibilities slipped through. Women who had been expected to remain confined to home suddenly found themselves commanding trucks, running radios, or managing hospitals. In that disruption, they carved out space for affection that otherwise might have been impossible. You imagine a factory floor at midnight, sparks flying as women weld music crackling faintly from a radio. Two workers pause, laugh at a shared joke brush hands over the metal bench. No one notices in the noise, but for them, it's a moment of connection that outshines the grind of war. You leave the barracks and hospitals behind and wander into the blacked-out cities of wartime Europe. Street lamps are dimmed, curtains are drawn, and every window is painted dark to hide from enemy bombers. Yet in those shadows, another world stirs. Cafes, nightclubs, and basement bars become meeting places where secrecy is both survival and invitation. In Paris, under occupation, queer nightlife didn't disappear. It slipped underground. Some cabarets stayed open, filled with music and cigarette smoke, where resistance fighters and lovers brushed shoulders. There are accounts of German officers themselves frequenting bars that tolerated same-sex couples, showing how complicated the city's underworld could be. Imagine the tension. One table whispers, plans to sabotage a railway, while across the room, two women dance slowly under flickering lights, hoping no one pays too much attention. Berlin, too, carried remnants of its once thriving queer culture. Before the Nazis, it had been one of the most open cities in the world for LGBTQ+ life. Even during the war, hidden clubs survived, doors opening only to those who knew the right knock. Survivors later remembered how dangerous it was, yet also how vital to know you weren't alone to see others like yourself, even if only for a stolen night. London had its own corners. Blackout gave cover to couples who might otherwise draw stares. In Soho, some pubs became known as safe spots, and American GIs on leave sometimes stumbled into them, finding a scene both strange and strangely familiar. One British veteran later recalled with a chuckle that the Yanks weren't just bringing nylons and chocolate. Even in New York, far from the battlefront, the wartime boom swelled the city with sailors, soldiers, and workers. Greenwich Village and Harlem bars, filled with uniforms, some carrying secrets they dared not voice outside those walls. For many, these nights were the first time they experienced freedom, even if it lasted only until the morning reveille. Think of how odd it must have felt by day. Total discipline, orders barked, roles fixed. By night, music, laughter, and the thrill of slipping off the mask. The same man who marched in perfect step on the parade ground might be the same man holding another's hand under a table in a smoky club. Wartime nightlife wasn't just about escape. It was about survival of spirit. In a world collapsing under bombs and rationing, these secret spaces became small acts of defiance. They said even in the darkest blackout, people would still find a way to love. The museum glass is clean and still, but behind it lies a scrap of faded fabric, a triangle of pink cloth. It looks small, almost ordinary, until you realize what it meant in Nazi Germany. That patch, stitched onto the prison uniforms of men accused of homosexuality, was not decoration. It was branding, humiliation, and often a death sentence. The Nazis didn't invent laws against same-sex relationships. Paragraph 175 had already criminalized homosexuality in Germany since the 19th century. But under Hitler, it became sharper, harsher, more aggressively enforced. Tens of thousands of men were arrested. Some were sent to regular prisons, others to concentration camps, where the pink triangle marked them out for isolation and abuse. In camps like Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, men wearing the pink triangle often received the hardest labor and the worst rations. Guards treated them with open contempt, and even fellow prisoners sometimes shunned them. Yet in the middle of that cruelty, bonds still formed. Survivors later recalled how a stolen glance, a whispered word, or a crust of bread shared in secret could feel like an act of resistance. One of the most haunting testimonies comes from Pierre Seal, a French teenager arrested after being identified at a gathering spot known for queer men. He was tortured, imprisoned, and eventually forced into German military service. For decades after liberation, he stayed silent, too afraid of stigma in his own community. When he finally spoke out late in life, his story revealed not only the horrors of Nazi persecution, but also the burden of silence that followed long after the war ended. Women faced danger too, though the records are murkier. Female homosexuality wasn't prosecuted under paragraph 175, but women were still swept into camps under other categories, asocial criminal or political. Survivor accounts suggest that relationships between women in camps sometimes offered emotional lifelines, small pockets of comfort in a world designed to strip people of dignity. The pink triangle later transformed into a symbol of pride when activists in the 1970s reclaimed it. But in the 1940s, it was meant to shame, isolate, and destroy. Imagine standing in a freezing barrack, guards stomping past and still choosing to lean against another prisoner for warmth. In that moment, affection itself became defiance. It's here you see one of the darkest truths of the war for queer people under Nazi rule. Survival wasn't just about dodging bombs or bullets. It was about protecting the very right to exist. You leave the camps behind and turn to the other side of the war, where the Allies loudly declared they were fighting for freedom, yet carried their own contradictions. Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, all depended on queer citizens to serve, and thousands did. But at the same time, those same governments treated homosexuality as a threat to order. It's like being invited to dinner, and then told you can't sit at the table. In the US, the military explicitly banned homosexual conduct. Men and women suspected of it could be dishonorably discharged sometimes after humiliating investigations. Yet the manpower crisis was so severe that many suspected cases were ignored as long as the soldier kept performing. Historians have found records of officers who quietly looked the other way because they couldn't afford to lose skilled code breakers, nurses, or mechanics. The war needed everyone, even those the law disapproved of. Britain was no different. Homosexuality remained illegal under civilian law, and service members caught in relationships faced court-martial. But the reality on the ground was messier. One RAF pilot later recalled that his squadron knew about his relationship with another airman and chose to laugh it off because his flying skills were too valuable to lose. In other words, skill trumped stigma, at least until the war ended. Women faced another layer of contradiction. Members of Britain's Auxiliary Territorial Service, or America's Women's Army Corps, often became targets of rumor. Newspapers hinted that female barracks were hotbeds of inappropriate behavior. Commanders worried about discipline, but oral histories reveal many women ignored the whispers and carried on forming bonds that gave them strength through the long years. Imagine being judged for simply existing in a uniform, then daring to find comfort in someone who understood exactly what you were facing. Canada and Australia followed similar patterns, harsh rules on paper, selective enforcement in practice. Across the Allied world, queer soldiers served bravely, sometimes celebrated for their heroism in battle, only to be punished once their private lives came to light. The case of U.S. Army nurse Myrtle Hilliard, who was dismissed after anonymous accusations about her relationships, shows how precarious service could be. The irony cuts deep. Allies claimed to be defending liberty against tyranny, but for queer citizens, liberty was conditional, always shadowed by fear of exposure. Still, many chose to serve anyway, believing in the larger cause, or simply knowing that their country needed them. Their loyalty wasn't to governments that condemned them, but to comrades standing beside them. Picture the contradiction, marching proudly in uniform, risking your life for your nation, while knowing that the same uniform could be stripped away if someone discovered the wrong letter in your pocket. That was the double standard of the Allies' war effort. You sit at a desk covered in yellowed envelopes, cracked leather diaries, and fading photographs. Unlike the loud speeches of generals or the bold headlines in wartime newspapers, these scraps of paper tell the quieter truths. Soldiers who couldn't speak their feelings aloud left them between the lines of letters. Nurses tucked hints into diary margins. Friends scribbled names in code so no censor could understand. Letters were lifelines. Families waited for news, but for queer service members, letters doubled as a dangerous thread. Some wrote innocently enough for the censors, then layered affection beneath. A line like "I miss our walks by the river" might seem ordinary, but to the person receiving it, it meant everything. A few brave souls pushed further writing with such tenderness that even decades later reading them makes your heart stop. One British soldier ended a note simply, "Forever yours, though no one must know." Diaries offered more freedom. Hidden in rucksacks or tucked under pillows, they recorded the reality that official reports ignored. A Canadian airman wrote how his bunkmate's laugh kept the winter at bay. An American WAC described nights of whispered conversations in the dark, calling them "my only rest." These fragments, never meant for public eyes, survive because someone cared enough to keep them safe long after the war ended. Not all were hidden, though. Some archives contain photographs of soldiers posing with arms around each other, grinning at the camera. To outsiders, they look like camaraderie. But when you read the notes on the back, nicknames, heart's affectionate phrases, you see the double meaning. They were snapshots of love disguised as friendship. The danger was real. Censors could intercept letters. Commanders could confiscate diaries. That's why so many voices vanished. They were destroyed out of fear. What survives feels miraculous, as if paper itself conspired to hold on to the truth. Think of your own texts and photos today. How many small details carry private meanings only you and one other person would notice? Now imagine someone telling you those memories had to be burned for your safety. That's what queer soldiers faced, choosing between memory and survival. The archives remind you that war wasn't just fought in trenches and skies. It was fought in the quiet effort to preserve love in ink and paper. And somehow, against orders against silence, those words still made it through. What if the end of the war didn't bring freedom for everyone, but a different kind of silence? You picture cheering crowds in Times Square, confetti raining down soldiers, kissing sweethearts in front of flashing cameras. It's the iconic image of victory, but not every story fit the photograph. For queer veterans, the war ended with medals in one hand and secrecy in the other. In America, Britain, and across the Allied world, the return to peacetime meant returning to laws that still criminalized homosexuality. Men and women who had risked their lives for their countries found themselves quietly erased. Some were discharged without honors, their records marked with phrases like undesirable or moral unfitness. Others kept their heads down, folding away letters, hiding photographs, never speaking of what they had felt in barracks or trenches. Germany told its own darker tale. When Allied forces liberated concentration camps, men imprisoned under paragraph 175 weren't always freed in the way you'd expect. Some were transferred directly into regular prisons to finish their sentences because the law against them remained in force long after Hitler was gone. Imagine surviving the Nazis only to remain branded a criminal by the very people claiming to bring justice. The silence stretched for decades. Veterans' reunions rarely mentioned the attachments that had sustained so many. Memoirs skipped over the details. It wasn't until late in the 20th century that survivors began to speak publicly, their voices often shaking with both memory and relief. Pierre Seal, the French survivor of Nazi camps, didn't tell his story until the 1990s. American poet Robert Duncan only published his reflections long after his dismissal. For many, it took a lifetime to feel safe enough to say out loud what had once been obvious in the dark of a barracks. And yet those buried memories still mattered. They shaped friendships that lasted decades, quiet households built between two veterans who told neighbors they were just roommates, poems that hinted at feelings no one was supposed to name. The war had forced people together under unbearable conditions, and what they found in each other didn't vanish with peace, it just went underground. Today, historians dig through those letters and diaries, piecing together the untold side of World War II. Activists reclaim the pink triangle as a badge of resilience instead of shame. Museums now display uniforms and photographs that once would have been hidden. Each rediscovery proves that the silence never truly erased the truth. So as you listen to the last echoes of this story, think of a soldier folding away a letter in 1944, tucking it deep into his pack. He doesn't know if he'll survive the battle tomorrow, but he knows those words matter. Decades later, they reach you. That's the untold history of homosexuality in Weiwei. Not erased, just waiting like an unopened envelope for someone to finally read it. Behind the tanks and victory parades, Fu also carried hidden stories of queer soldiers, men carving affection into barracks, life women forming secret bonds in hospitals and factories, and prisoners branded with pink triangles who suffered in silence. Their voices, once buried, remind us that war was never just about armies. And now, another hidden front calls the secret life of women in WH2. Bang sirens steam, and 1,000 hammers your ears walk in before you do, and the floor trembles like a giant drumline warming up for history's loudest shift as you step into a wartime factory that smells like hot metal and caffeinated resolve. And yes, you, in those borrowed overalls, are about to discover that the most dangerous machine here might be the rumor mill. You press forward between conveyor belts, clanking out bombers, shell ships plates, and a new identity. And you feel the eyes of foremen and old-timers slide over you, measuring your hands, your hair tucked up under a scarf, your shoulders squaring to a job that just months ago someone swore you could never do. People still repeat the poster, "We can do it," as if the ink grants permission. But you already know the secret. The poster wasn't called Rosie until later. The real Rosies are the ones who come in early, tie back their bangs, and figure out what to do when the rivet gun jams and the boss pretends not to notice. You find your rhythm to the thrum of Willow Run in Michigan, punching out B-24 Liberators like a bakery turning loaves, and to the shipyard whistles in Richmond, where Henry J. Kaiser adds a miracle to the schedule and childcare to the benefits, because someone finally realizes you can't rivet hull plates while chasing toddlers. The Lanham Act funds daycare centers with nap mats and snack time, and you drop off a small hand at the door, memorize the teacher's smile, and march to your station. Is that freedom duty or both? On payday, your envelope still weighs less than a man's, about 60 cents to his dollar in the US, and the numbers scrape you the way steel filings scrape skin. But right now, you grip the rivet gun, the metal shivers, and the airplane skin seals with a satisfying thwack that says the sky will hold. You're not alone. In Britain, you slide into a munitions line under the wary eye of a supervisor who remembers World War I's Canary Girls, their skin stained from TNT. The lab coats swear. This time, the formulas are safer, the masks better, the ventilation improved, and you nod because the war timetable doesn't pause for health bulletins. In Canada, you hear about Elsie McGill, the queen of the hurricanes, an engineer in charge of Hawker Hurricane production, who rewrites factory manuals in plain language so you can learn faster, mess up less, and hit deadlines that keep pilots alive. In the Soviet Union, women juggle furnaces and lathes through winters that bite bone. They don't wait for posters. There aren't enough posters, and besides, posters don't lift castings. In Germany, ideology said women belonged at home until reality revised the script and women in industry rose while foreign forced laborers were pulled in under watch. You clock that contradiction and file it next to today's memo on productivity targets. You learn a new fashion that isn't on any runway. The hair scarf tied tight to keep curls out of gears. The practical turban that makes your grandmother proud. The slacks you swore you'd never wear in public. The sturdy shoes that squeak like honest work. A woman down the line jokes that victory red lipstick and safety goggles are the look of 1943, and you grin because a dash of red on a gray morning is morale with a brush tip. The foreman insists on rules, no jewelry, no loose sleeves, no leaning. You create your own rules. Buddy checks before the belt starts shared thermos at the mid-shift break. One person learns the machine manual, so everyone else can ask smarter questions. You run straight into the old suspicions, of course. A man mutters that women can't handle torque. You torque. Another says your nimble fingers suit delicate work. You weld a seam so clean, his inspection mirror fogs with embarrassment. A union meeting debates whether you're temporary. You sit in the front row, raise your hand, and ask about dues seniority and safety guards for the new press. When someone calls you girl over the intercom, you let it skate past and answer with the part number because the airplane doesn't care what they call you, only whether the rivets line up. Race cracks the floor long before the concrete does. You see black women turned away at one gate and hired at another after A. Philip Randolph threatens a march on Washington, and Executive Order 8802 says defense factories can't discriminate on paper. In practice, the locker room gets noisy, the schedule gets mysterious, and the most dangerous tool becomes the assignment board. You ally up on cigarette breaks, compare notes, and decide that if the war needs every hand, then every hand will demand a glove that fits. A supervisor grumbles, but production numbers smile on whoever shows up and ships parts, and that's your quiet leverage. You get good so good that time bends. Your hands memorize the heft of a pneumatic drill. Your ears learn the tiny pitch change that means a bit is about to snap your eyes. Measure a fraction at a glance. You trade tips like recipes. Hold the gun at this angle. Rest your elbow here. Count breaths to steady the line. The day you break your personal record for fastening panels, you don't cheer. You just nod, sip lukewarm coffee, and move to the next fuselage because the convoy needs one more aircraft and you like the way competence warms your spine. Home asks for the old you at 5 o'clock, but the stamp of oil on your forearm says the new you is staying for dinner. You flip ration coupons like playing cards, turn carrots into victory cake, and learn to change a fuse with one hand while calming a child with the other. If you have no child, you still find yourself doing a second shift laundry, queuing neighbors' errands, while the newspapers print tidy cartoons about Rosie with arms folded and no sweat marks. You do sweat. You also laugh more than you expected, usually at something small, like the office clerk who dictates a memo in stiff grammar while his collar is quietly taped because he tore it on a crate. The factory finds small ways to welcome you and big ways to test you. There's a bulletin board with bowling night flyers and reminders about deportment. There's a suggestion box where one of your friends proposes a jig redesign that saves 20 minutes per wing. Management adopts it and calls it innovative, not remembering it was written on the back of a grocery list with a crayon. Do you ever wonder, in those 5 minutes, when the line stops, whose bright idea gets a bonus and whose gets a pat on the shoulder? Hold that thought. You'll need it when victory posters go up, and some people forget who kept the screws turning. Faintly across the noise, a band radio sneaks in big band brass, and you hum while aligning holes. The music works better than coffee, and you slide into a groove that feels like dance steps with steel-toed shoes. A friend teaches you to count beats between rivets. Another tells stories about her pre-war desk job and how this place is louder, but somehow clearer. You always know what success looks like: a straight row, a clean weld, a crate sealed tight. Numbers measure everything: output per hour, defects per 100 units, absences per week. You start measuring something they don't: the quiet confidence in your chest that didn't exist before you put on this uniform of denim and grit. On the rare slow day, a supervisor walks the line with a clipboard and an awkward pep talk about our girls and your section lead, who is 42, divorced, and nobody's girl keeps on checking tolerances. You trade a look and continue. The newest hire asks you whether her hands will ever stop shaking around the drill. You tell her to press the base to her hip, breathe like she's blowing dust off a mirror, and let the weight of the tool do its job. She does. The hole bites perfect, and the grin that follows is the closest thing to a medal you'll see this month. At lunch, you sit on a crate under a skylight, peel an orange that tastes like a gift from far away, and read a letter from a cousin who says the neighborhood priest preached that women at work risk forgetting their nature. You smile, tuck the letter away, and pass half your orange to the woman who solved yesterday's gear jam with a hairpin and a prayer. By the time the whistle sends you back, you've learned 2 new names, 3 new tricks, and exactly how to make your scarf knot sit flat under earmuffs. Before the afternoon shift, you run a thumb along the smooth edge of a panel and think about how quickly the world can be retooled when it must, and how slowly habits bend when nobody is watching. Quick poll: if you were writing the company history, would you put the childcare center near the front or tuck it in an appendix? You pull your gloves tight, grab the rivet gun, and line up the next row, because the answer, like the airplane, will be built one fastener at a time. You trade denim and oil for khaki, and creases step into a quartermaster's world where the tape measure rules, and discover that a uniform is less a costume than a contract you sign with buttons, pins, and a promise to show up on time with your hair tamed under fabric geometry that could pass for a small engineering project. The garrison cap sits at a particular tilt. Not cute, not crooked, just regulation. And you learn the magician's trick of flattening pin curls with those same hairpins that saved a gear jam on yesterday's line. Because if a bobby pin can hold a machine, it can certainly negotiate with gravity on your bangs. Drill instructors call cadence, and your boots answer. And you clock fast. That military marching is choreography with consequences, the kind where a heel slightly late becomes a ripple. Everyone can hear like a dropped pan in a quiet kitchen. You've signed into the WAC at Fort Des Moines before auxiliary gets retired, and you're WAC proper in 1943. Or you've gone Navy as a wave, or earned an Eagle Globe and anchor in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. Or you're British ATS, learning to haul cables and keep calm around searchlights. Or you're WAF, with headphones on, living inside the heartbeat of radar. And the first time the scope paints a ghost of an incoming raid, Your pencil steadying on a grid feels like the world asking you to draw a straight line quickly. Uniforms promise sameness, but they are quietly bespoke the way everyone's handwriting is secretly different, and you see it immediately: the woman who folds her sleeves with surgeon precision, the one who sneaks a tiny stitch at the side seam for a more forgiving fit, the radio tech who writes tiny mnemonics inside her cap band, like Red Right returning for signal flags, even though she's inland and mostly lives in Morse. Secret codes bloom everywhere, not just the kind that clack across keys. There's the sleeve tug that means switch me to the handset, the pencil tap that means you missed a digit, the shared grimace that says the lieutenant will ask for that report twice. Regulations breathe down your neck, and then if you're smart, you learn to breathe back, hair above the collar. Yes, but the reality of wind rain and engine wash demands more artistry than the handbook expected. So the barracks invent stylings that hold through calisthenics and carburetor checks. The U.S. Marines roll out a lipstick called Montezuma Red to match the scarlet trim on the dress blues. The Navy waves get shades that don't fight the uniform, and somewhere between the mirror and the morning inspection, you decide that a swipe of color is less vanity than armor. Bright as a flag in a gray corridor, you meet the Wasps at Avenger Field in Texas, and suddenly the runway smells like sun-warmed rubber and aviation fuel, and fresh nerves, the kind that fizz behind your ears as you step toward a trainer aircraft with wings that look like the idea of freedom bravely sketched in aluminum. Jacqueline Cochran pushes for better conditions and harder assignments because she knows that the only way to end the annoying lady pilot footnote is to fly the work nobody can argue with. And Nancy loves ferry pilots lift new planes from factories to bases with maps that really are paper and clouds that really are bumpy. And if someone mutters that women shouldn't fly pursuits, you note that landing a P-51 in a crosswind is mostly a conversation with physics. Across the Atlantic, you learn the voice of a British motorcycle at dawn as ATS dispatch riders snake through city shadows with canvas satchels and stiff fingers, and you watch WRNs in storerooms and on signal lamps, their notebooks filled with penciled timings and neat abbreviations that make sense if you live in two worlds at once, the one where messages travel on wires and the one where you still remember your mother showing you how to hem a skirt without puckers. The trick you notice is not that these women have abandoned the domestic toolkit. It's that they've repurposed it at scale, turning the art of tidiness into the science of logistics without breaking a sweat over the label. Training is a comedy of sore muscles seasoned with very serious instructions. You learn to field strip a rifle for the same reason you learn to open a stuck jar, because somebody has to. And today, the somebody is you. You memorize first aid protocols. Memorize more acronyms than a pack of corporate slide decks. Memorize the kitchen's posted calorie counts that never seem to match the actual potatoes. And somewhere around week 3, you realize you can run further than you thought you could if the cadence song is ridiculous enough to distract your brain from your shins. Quick poll: does counting steps help you drift? Or do you prefer the trick where you name all the cities on your train route backwards? People read a uniform like a headline, and sometimes they read it wrong. In town, a shopkeeper gives you a discount with a wink because his niece is WAF, and then a stranger scolds you for abandoning proper womanhood between carrots and canned milk, and you answer with patience you didn't know you packed, reminding him that proper womanhood currently includes keeping engines warm and paperwork accurate and morale less wobbly than the stool he's standing on to lecture you. Back on base, a captain thanks your team for fixing the generator. Later, another officer asks whether you girls need help carrying ledgers, and you let the ledger thump the desk to demonstrate the physics of assumptions. Ritual becomes the scaffolding of your day inspection. Mail call mess duty, the particular hush that falls in a barracks just before lights out, when dozens of bodies agree to be quiet together. Sleep arrives tidy and leaves scattered, and you discover the nocturnal language of blankets, sliding coughs politely swallowed and whispers short enough to dodge a sergeant's ears. Someone always has a contraband tea bag. Someone has a sewing kit. Someone can coax a stuck drawer. Someone knows every verse of a marching song. And these, too, are codes you decode as you settle into a new version of home, where your footlocker becomes a tiny kingdom with a lock and a folded photograph in the lid. Work tells you who trusts you. In mixed anti-aircraft batteries, you watch British women calculate firing solutions faster than the metal can cool their chalkboards, filling with trajectories, while searchlights carve the sky. In U.S. Signal Corps units, you handle switchboards like pipe organs, all chords and timing connecting voices under pressure and cutting through static with the same calm you use to untangle a necklace knot. In quartermaster depots, ledger entries march with a clarity your last office job never required, because here a miscount doesn't cost a paperclip. It costs a delivery window. Tiny rebellions carry you through the parts of service no recruitment poster mentioned. A patient swap of duty days so a friend can sneak to a base wedding. A pair of wool socks discreetly traded to a mechanic who can find you a better fitting cap. A hand-lettered sign taped inside a locker, hydrate then gripe. You're not breaking the system. You're sanding down its splinters so people can hold it longer without bleeding. And if that sounds like housework, it is only with more acronyms and fewer potlucks. Your body learns new math. You can lift a crate to waist height without holding your breath. You can climb onto a wing root without thinking about skirts, because the uniform has solved that for you. You can make a bed tight enough to bounce a coin, even when your hands are cold, because the sergeant's coin bounce ritual is weirdly satisfying in the way a perfect spreadsheet is satisfying today. You stop apologizing for taking the lane on the barracks stairs. You start apologizing for underestimating yourself last month, which is a nicer apology to carry around. If you're in the Soviet Union, you watch women fly night harassment missions in PO-2 biplanes, the Germans nickname night witches. Their fabric wings whispering over the lines as they cut engines and glide in with the kind of nerve that readers decades later will label legendary, while you recall that mostly it was cold fingers, dark fields, and a map you could feel with your teeth when you bit it to keep from losing it. The plane lands because you coax it to, and the ground crew is mostly you as well, tightening wires, checking plugs, making the old airframe a partner instead of a prop. There's a code you keep that isn't on any chart. The one that says you will claim your competence out loud when a superior forgets your rank, that you will nudge a quieter woman to speak first in a briefing, that you will annotate a manual when the official language gets foggy, because clarity under pressure might not look heroic on a poster, but it looks heroic at 02 or 0 when the generator hiccups. Remember the suggestion box in the factory that ate good ideas and burped a memo. Here, you sometimes get the satisfaction of watching a note become a standing order if it saves time or avoids scraped knuckles. On inspection day, the world narrows to lint and line. and your hands smooth fabric, while your brain recites checklists that sound like lullabies once you've lived in them long enough. The captain's shoes click down the row. The clipboard ticks, and your heart taps a tempo that is not exactly fear and not exactly boredom. More like the sharp awareness of being seen by a system that can't fully see you, yet the way a map can outline a city without knowing the names people whisper to their corners and cupboards. Somewhere, a trumpet practices 3 notes. Somewhere, a typewriter stutters. Somewhere, a message arrives in code that you decode with a smile because it's from your friend on night duty, and it says only tea. You follow the smell of antiseptic and strong tea into a tent that flaps like a nervous lung. And the first thing you learn about nursing in wartime is that the clock here doesn't tick so much as pant, a quick and out rhythm, timed to stretchers that arrive with mud whispers and the kind of eye contact people make when they've run out of sturdy words. You adjust the lamp check, the tray, and rehearse the dance glove, swab tape, reassure move. Field hospitals look nothing like the crisp posters. They're more like organized weather fronts and currents, warm zones near stoves. Cold drafts by the canvas seams, thunder in the distance that could be artillery or your own pulse. Your hands memorize procedures faster than your mind can narrate them. Sulfa powder drifts like bitter snow onto cleaned wounds. Plasma bottles sway from improvised hooks. A syringe of morphine waits at the ready with the same quiet authority as a seasoned sergeant. Penicillin, that headline grabber, starts filtering in more reliably by 1944, and you feel the shift in your bones. The infections that used to gnaw at hope now blink and recede if you catch them early enough, and you keep a mental list of which unit's supply officers are good at bargaining, so you can trade for another vial with the diplomacy of a street market. If logistics is a language, you're fluent by week 2. Triage becomes your compass because there's no other way to steer. You move the truly urgent to the front with a grip that says, here now. You bundle the stable for later, like delicate packages you promise to return to, and you learn to see past noise, past blood, past the guilt that sneaks in when someone calls sister from the wrong pile, and you have to keep moving. British QAIMNs, nurses fold their cap veils with practiced calm. American Army nurses tighten their white bands until they feel like vows. Australian nurses in the islands roll sleeves and write times on tags with pencil stubs, and everyone counts respirations like a metronome at a concert you'd rather postpone. The tent changes personality at night. Lantern light paints everything honey-colored, and the shadows learn your name. A shell lands far off, the canvas trembles, and the bottle rack sings a little chime you didn't ask for. Midnight fears don't jump out. They sidle in. Did you miscalculate that dosage? Is that cough ordinary? Will the rain seep under cots before dawn? You write notes clearer than your pre-war diary ever was. You smooth blankets the way you smoothed fuselage panels. Long, steady strokes. And you discover that a nurse's lullaby is mostly information delivered at a temperature the listener can hold. You collect small victories like buttons in a tin, a pulse that evens out after a transfusion, a socket wrench recovered from a pocket before it tears the sheets, a letter dictated to a shaky voice that thanks a mother without frightening her. You create rituals that pass for luck one breath. Before you cut a bandage, 2 taps of the thermometer against your knuckle, a whispered steady to the clamp that likes to wander. When a surgeon mutters, "Good catch," you pocket the words like a snack for the next storm. And if a different surgeon forgets to use your name, you answer anyway, because the priority is the patient, and identity can be sorted after handover. Real figures keep you company like mentors at the edge of your vision. You think of Florence Nightingale's lamp, not because it's romantic, but because light is a tool, and you angle your torch just so to see whether that sutured edge is holding. You hear stories of Dorothy Still and the Navy nurses in the Philippines who kept a camp hospital going under captivity with improvisation so relentless it ought to be its own medal. You remember Vivian Bullwinkle, the Australian nurse who survived when many did not, and later insisted on telling the truth, with a steadiness you wish you could bottle for bad nights. These names aren't wallpaper, they're handrails. Do you keep any in your pocket for when your voice goes smaller than your job? Enzio teaches you the color of dust when it's part smoke, part sea salt. Normandy teaches you the weight of a wet boot and the exact tone a wounded man uses when he's making a joke to help you help him. The Pacific teaches you how to persuade humidity to behave just long enough for a dressing to stay put. In North Africa, sand sneaks into tape, into tea, into the pages of your pocket notebook, where your tidy writing begins to slant with fatigue and resolve. On hospital ships, you learn the choreography of swaying corridors and how to brace a tray with a hip so the cups don't skate. None of it is glamorous. All of it is precise. You police your own voice for warmth and speed. Too soft, and it floats away. Too brisk, and it bruises. You develop a tone like a good radio, clear low, a little smile tucked in, because reassurance is part medication, and humor skillfully used isn't disrespect. It's scaffolding. This will sting, you say, because honesty scales better than promises. Tell me about your dog, you suggest, because a sentence that begins in a backyard can sometimes walk a person through pain better than any marching song. Somewhere in there, you remember to drink water, though never as much as every manual recommends. Paperwork follows you the way a shadow follows a lamp. Charts tags, supply counts the math of blood, and bottles, your pencil becomes a conductor's baton for an orchestra that mustn't miss a beat. You file, you sign, you correct a transcription, because a 1 mistaken for a 7 can write the wrong story into a vial. Someone jokes that you could run a department store with this skill set. You correct them gently in a department store socks aren't on the line. Then you add with the bedside humor that saves your edges that you'd still color code the socks. Quiet camaraderie knits the ward tighter than stitches. There's the orderly, who can lift without jostling. The pharmacist's mate, who always has gauze at the exact moment you run out. The surgeon, who says thank you like it costs nothing. The driver, who brings stretchers in with a warning shout that lets your hands prepare. Among nurses, friendship is partly logistics. You swap nights so someone can nap. You share the last good pair of scissors. You teach the new recruit the trick with the tape that keeps IV lines from tugging when a patient turns. You don't talk about fear much. You talk about tea. The tea is, of course, about fear. Sometimes the front door opens on history running. During the Battle of the Bulge, the air bites and you bite back double gloving because the cold turns fingertips clumsy. During air raids in London, blackout curtains make every ward feel like a secret, and you escort cots into corridors while sirens curl along your spine like a borrowed tale. In the Philippines, tropical nights wrap the ward in a velvet heat, and you count breaths while the frogs outside compete with the generator for volume. Does your mind ever flit to modern analogies, project management crisis, communications? Those TED-ish phrases about staying calm. You smile privately at that. Calm is a verb here, not a state. Faith for some becomes a quiet pocket you touch without fuss. A small cross, tucked in a blouse, a folded prayer, on a card, a habit of checking the sky at dawn, because you have convinced yourself that a certain pink means fewer admissions. Others lay their steadiness on routine alone, a bed made with hospital corners, a tray reset between cases to the exact same layout, a whispered checklist at the start of each hour that goes, tools, temps, tubes, tea. Whatever your ballast, you keep it invisible like good makeup under a gas mask there if needed, not the point of the outfit. You keep learning. You learn to hear a bad fever before the thermometer proves it. You learn to change a dressing with one hand when the other is occupied, with a grip that says, "Stay with me." You learn to spot the jitter in a smile that means pain's about to spike, and to preempt it with a measured dose rather than waiting nobly for drama. You learn that some people need the story of their scar narrated back to them to begin folding it into their life, and you do it with a steadiness that makes narrative feel like a medical device. Occasionally, you get a letter back from someone who made it home. The handwriting looks less wobbly, the ink less smudged, and the dog you asked about is apparently still stealing socks. The letter thanks the nurse with the quiet laugh, and you suspect it's you, though half your ward has quiet laughs, because volume control is a survival tactic after midnight. You tuck the letter in your kit, not to gloat, but to remember that the spreadsheets of survival, numbers of lives saved, percentages of infections reduced, are built one thank you at a time, one temperature that moved in the right direction. And then the door flaps open again, and another stretcher arrives with boots. You wipe a jacket, you fold a face that looks at you like you might be the first calm thing they've seen today. You are not a poster, and you are not a slogan. You are the steady in the storm, the precise in the blur, the voice that turns panic into steps. 1, 2, 3. And the hands that make penicillin morphine bandage, and patience look like a single word anyone can pronounce if you say it slowly enough to follow. Crash. Your heart drops 3 floors in one beat as a knock you weren't expecting raps twice on the pensione door. And you realize the most dangerous sound in occupied Europe is ordinary, because ordinary is where secrets hide best. And tonight you're dressed like a woman on errands, with a basket of onions while your pockets hold paper that can topple a bridge. You smooth your skirt count to 3 open with a bored expression you practiced in a cracked mirror. And the first lesson of espionage walks in on quiet shoes. You aren't James Bond. You are the coat rack. The church bell stroke the person nobody remembers until they do. Training gave you tricks and jokes that stopped being funny after week 1. You can leave no heel click on cobbles if you roll your foot like a cat. You can fold a silk map to a postage stamp. You can flick a fuse into a culvert and walk away discussing the price of carrots. You can treat a hairpin like a tiny crowbar, which is oddly familiar if you once unjammed a factory gear with the same tool. The best gadget isn't the time pencil or the plastic explosive with the innocent name. It's your face, calm, a little preoccupied, busy with groceries, and the second best is a bicycle that looks too tired to be dangerous. They taught you codes until your dreams rhymed with ciphers. You stitch a poem into numbers, tuck numbers into radio groups, and wrangle a suitcase transmitter that weighs as much as a disobedient dog. If you're in Paris, your handle might be Madeline, and your name is Noor Inayat Khan, a wireless operator who keeps sending even when the net shrinks. The rooftop wires sing like laundry lines, and every tap of the key is both courage and a countdown as detection vans prowl. If you're in the Auvergne, you ride until your calves combust 100 kilometers of French hills to replace compromised codes, and when you lean your bike against a wall, your breath writes steam spells in the midnight air, and a baker watches you with the grateful stare people keep for bread that arrives in a famine. In the SOE, you meet women who look like school teachers and behave like thunder. Odette Sansom carries photographs pinned inside her clothing and remembers every false address as if she grew up there. And when questioned, she outlasts daylight because her stubbornness is an element, not a mood. Violette Sabo runs across a field with a Sten gun and the grace of a sprinter who hates wasting steps. The grass wets her stockings, and her ring holds a locket of a child's hair that doesn't make her any less professional. Nancy Wake laughs like a door flung open, bosses a maquis, camp before breakfast, and earns the nickname the White Mouse because the hunters never quite catch her tail, though they try with all the resources of a bad imagination. Your handler's handler is Vera Atkins with files that look like paper but function like armor. She knows your backstory better than you do, corrects a birth date you flubbed in rehearsal, and checks that your forged ration card smells faintly of pantry because the real ones always do. Christina Scarbeck. Christine Granville talks her way into a prison and then back out with the keys practically apologizing in her hand, and you take notes on her kind of elegance, which is not silk, but nerve tailored to the moment, with the fit of destiny if destiny wore boots. The work refuses glamour the way a cat refuses a bath. You copy train timetables at a cafe with your wrist tilted to hide the angle of your pen. You examine a bridge abutment like a traveler admiring the river while your sleeve hides measurements. You pin a packet under a park bench, then circle back 2 hours later to confirm it walked. The most thrilling thing you do is often the plainest stand in a bread line and listen as the baker's wife mentions an unusual convoy through the valley, then ask a too casual question about flour delivery schedules to gauge whether the convoy is routine or fresh. Quick poll. Do you find the steady, ordinary mask easier than the theatrical kind, or do you prefer a character with a little glitter? Sometimes the story flips, and you're not in the field at all. You're in a room that hums like a hive, where women in cardigans run the great machine of secrecy. At Bletchley Park, Joan Clark solves riddles with patience that could knit fog. WRNS. Wrens feed paper through bombs that complain in metal soprano, and you discover the daily miracle of being very young and very useful, while the world insists on calling you girls even as you tilt the chessboard of the Atlantic by teasing U-boats out of silence. You eat sandwiches at your desk, pencil tucked behind your ear eyes, doing arithmetic with frequencies, while your supervisor misplaces your surname at lunchtime. Invisible ink smells disappointingly like lemon juice milk and old habits, and you master the risk calculus of trivial tasks. How many times can you visit the same post office before the clerk gets curious? Which grocer will swear he's known you since school, if anyone asks? And which grocer is polite because he's too alert? The map you hide under your hem scratches your thigh when you walk too quickly. The microdot inside your button makes the button heavier in your imagination, which is a reminder that craft is half physics, half theater. Your cover stories taste like oatmeal, plain plausible filling, and you repeat them until even you believe you prefer oatmeal. Fear is not an event, it's a roommate. It tucks into bed beside you when trucks idle outside at midnight. It sits on the tram as a patrol boards with slow gazes and fast hands. You learn tricks to shrink it. Recite the names of mountains, match your breathing, to the tempo of your steps. Choose 3 objects in any room you could use as alibis or tools. A newspaper for camouflage, a shoelace for a binding, a teacup for a distraction that shatters just when you need a shout. Remember our factory suggestion box that swallowed genius and returned a memo. In the field, your improvements remain anonymous by design. But when a teammate borrows your trick of hiding a transmitter in a baby pram, and it sails through a checkpoint with a yawn, you feel the strange pride of authorship without a byline. The resistance is a web, not a ladder, and women keep it sticky. Couriers, whose names stay out of books, drift through markets with messages in their hems. Jewish women in Poland pass as Catholic nannies with forged papers and courage that never brags. Dutch students like Hannie Shaft ride red-haired and ferocious through dunes where the wind tastes of salt and argument. In hiding places above watch shops, Corey, Ten Boom's family, squeezes strangers into precious inches of space and opens the door to requests that weigh less in reality than in memory, because the doing becomes what people are. You pack bread, a message, and a face like yesterday's. Your humor becomes sly, local, soft-footed. You joke about stockings, not because stockings matter, but because pretending to care about a snag is a way to stand in a doorway long enough to count uniforms. You trade recipes that are half code, half comfort. Add a cup of patience. Stir until the patrol passes and you keep a straight face when a collaborator flirts. Not because he's charming, but because your job is to collect information without collecting trouble you can't afford. If modern life has taught you about emotional labor, you nod. Spycraft is its stealthy cousin, where keeping the room smooth is also keeping the room safe. You carry real figures in your pocket, like talismans you don't romanticize. Virginia Hall walks with a wooden leg nicknamed Cuthbert, outruns a manhunt across the Pyrenees, and returns anyway, because usefulness outranks comfort. When you lace your boots, you think not grand thoughts, but very small ones, like cushioning a blister, so your pace stays normal. Odette chooses silence when lies would be easier. Noor refuses to betray her net, Nancy bets. Everything on momentum. Scarbeck gambles on nerve over force, and none of it feels mythic from the inside. It feels like choosing the next right thing because time is short and the printer's ink won't dry itself. Checking your kit before dawn, you pat for papers, matches, chocolate safety, pin chalk, tiny torch, and the coin with a hole in it that would mean nothing to anyone else and everything to the person you're meeting. And for a flicker of a second, you remember the barracks coin bounce test on a perfect bed and the nurse's midnight checklist of tools, temps tubes, tea. This is the same muscle. You realize clarity under pressure. Only the stakes wear different hats. Somewhere nearby, a radio coughs to life. Somewhere far away, a clerk files a report that has the wrong woman's description, and you let the mistake huddle under your invisibility like a nervous bird. If you get away with today's delivery, it will be because your heel didn't catch, your voice didn't wobble, your curiosity didn't reach one question too far, and because a dozen strangers decided to be kind at the exact moment kindness looked like routine. You fold yourself into the tram crowd, a face, a scarf, a basket with onions that really are onions, and also, incidentally, the best cover a person ever invented because anyone can see. The world is complicated, but onions tell the nose what to think first. And tonight, that's all the advantage you asked for when you buttoned your coat and stepped out into streets that pretend to be ordinary, and sometimes are even when you're carrying a few ounces of tomorrow in your pocket. You queue under a damp sky, with ration book in one hand and a stubborn coin in the other, and you realize the home front is a theater of its own, where women star as mathematicians of scarcity. The clerk stamps pages with a rhythm steadier than church bells, and the grocery bag in your imagination feels heavy with things you can't actually buy. Sugar butter meat, all guarded by coupons as if calories were contraband, and you learn to calculate meals like puzzles where the prize is keeping family spirits up when the cupboard looks like a philosophy lesson in minimalism. Rationing isn't just arithmetic, it's choreography across continents. In Britain, you stand with your ticket in line, exchange points for a weekly allowance of bacon or margarine, and collect powdered eggs that look like yellow chalk, but fry up with enough imagination to pass as breakfast. In the United States, you cut stamps out of the OPA booklet, while a neighbor compares which butcher still honors them fairly, and you nod politely, though both of you know fairness is a moving target when there's a war on. In Germany, women juggle ersatz coffee that tastes like roasted barley and stretch flour with whatever filler is at hand. While in Japan, you find rice replaced by millet or sweet potatoes, and meals shrink as the war stretches longer. Everywhere, women improvise, and nobody writes songs about that, but maybe they should have. The kitchen turns into a laboratory of substitutions. Carrots sweeten cakes when sugar runs low. Mashed potatoes bulk out dough. Dried milk powder pretends to be cream with the right whisk. You clip recipes from government pamphlets that call these victory dishes, and you smirk because victory tastes a lot like boiled cabbage. The Ministry of Food suggests Woolton pie layers of vegetables under a crust of mashed potatoes, and you make it, of course. But secretly, you'd trade it all for the smell of real pastry and butter. Quick question: if you had to invent a cheerful name for a stew made of whatever happened to be left, what would you call it? Women in 1942 called it supper and made sure no one left the table hungry. Your day measures itself in lines. The queue at the shop, the queue at the bus, the queue at the post office for a parcel that might hold something precious, like dried fruit or stockings. Queues become social clubs, where gossip and recipes swap places faster than coupons, and the woman behind you explains how to make coffee from acorns, and the woman ahead of you shares news of her brother's latest letter, and you find yourself nodding like a parishioner in a strange new congregation of patients. Children stand on tiptoe to glimpse jars, memorize the shape of sweets they rarely taste, and sometimes lick the sugar paper after candy is gone because memory is its own dessert. The irony is thick enough to spread on bread posters. Till you dig for victory, and you do in backyards, in city parks, even in bomb craters where soil shakes off soot and grows cabbages. Women bend with hose in the land army boots, muddy cheeks, sunburnt hair tucked into scarves that once matched dresses. They keep cows plant rows, shear sheep, and return home with dirt under nails that once held a pen. The garden becomes insurance, the allotment a second pantry, and the kitchen a battlefield where your weapon is creativity and your uniform is an apron that smells faintly of onions and soap. Black markets hum like mischievous wasps at the edges. Someone whispers about butter under the counter, cigarettes tucked in flour sacks, or chocolate that fell off the back of a lorry. You weigh temptation against duty purse, against conscience, and sometimes slip a coin for a little extra because a birthday without cake feels like treason of the spirit. Authorities scold, but everyone knows morale feeds on more than slogans. And one orange in winter can restore a child's faith in tomorrow. Real figures walk through your ration lines too. Eleanor Roosevelt in the U.S. plants her own victory garden on the White House lawn and urges others to do the same. Clementine Churchill speaks to the British public with a calm that tastes more filling than powdered egg. Housewives' letters fill government offices with suggestions, complaints, and ingenious hacks. One proposes stretching soap with oatmeal. Another shares how to keep bread from going stale by wrapping it in cabbage leaves. These women never make headlines, yet their voices sculpt the everyday survival manual. The work of rationing isn't just feeding, it's morale management. You set the table with care polish, the one good spoon arrange plates, so the meal looks deliberate, not desperate. Children grow up, knowing oranges are treasure chocolate, a festival, and a Sunday roast, an event retold like a fairy tale. When the neighbor knocks with half a loaf or a jar of jam, the gift feels like victory itself. Hospitality shrinks in size, but not in heart. One biscuit split 3 ways still tastes like company. Some women keep diaries that read like cookbooks of scarcity. 2 ounces butter. 4 ounces flour. Stretch with dripping. One writes about a blackout night when the stew burned, but laughter kept the air warmer than blankets. Another recalls a parcel from Canada with raisins so exotic she baked them into 12 buns and let the children count them like jewels. Reading these today, you realize the genius wasn't in making do. It was in making do joyfully enough that the children remembered the laughter, louder than the hunger. And when you wash the last dish, scrape the pot, fold the ration book back into its drawer, you wonder whether future generations will believe you that whole nations learned to treat carrots as cake gardens, as arsenals, and patience as a form of patriotism. Tomorrow's line will be just as long, tomorrow's stew just as thin. But tonight, you know you've kept not only the body, but also the spirit of the home alive, and that might be the rarest recipe of all. You lean against the kitchen table paper, creased with smudges, and the ink on the letter is still wet enough to blur if your thumb lingers too long. Though you've read the words so many times, you could stitch them from memory. Letters arrive like bottled messages from a parallel world, each envelope smelling faintly of dust diesel and longing. And you open them with the same care you give to breaking an eggshell cleanly. The handwriting sometimes stumbles where the pen caught in a trench or on the deck of a rolling ship, but the rhythm is steady. Dearest sweetheart, my darling girl, you fold them carefully as though folding the distance itself. Writing back is its own kind of theater. You learn to choose words like spices, enough warmth to flavor, not so much that it draws censor's ink across the page. A joke about your new ration-friendly recipe passes through, but your complaint about last week's bombing raid is cut with neat black lines, leaving the sentence to limp without legs. You smile ruefully. Censors, after all, are the unintended audience of your love life. So you write around them in code only your beloved would catch. I finally saw the tulips bloom, might mean I'm safe, and the neighbor's dog is restless, might whisper, I miss your company too much. Sometimes you press flowers into the fold, fragile as promises, or add a doodle of a teapot, because routine comforts matter more than dramatic declarations. And sometimes the soldier replies with poems copied from memory, or jokes scribbled in the margin, or a lipstick kiss that smudged across the corner before you sealed it. Distance teaches you to read meaning in scraps, the choice of salutation, the frequency of mail, the hurried sign-off that feels like a hug cut short. Do you ever wonder how many modern text messages would survive censorship if every emoji had to pass inspection? Desire lingers in the gaps in sentences stretched thin to hide more than they say. Women who loved women wrote with careful hands, hiding intimacy in metaphors about weather sewing or favorite books. A letter might gush about the comfort of your voice on the wind, or the shelter of our last walk lines that sounded harmless enough to the censor, but bloomed with tenderness for the one who knew the code. Similarly, men on the front wrote to women at home with warmth so extravagant that it made the mothers and sisters laugh knowingly, but not always with recognition of what was left unspoken. The war created a paradox: separation sharpened affection, but silence guarded survival. Diaries held what letters couldn't. A nurse might scribble about a smile she couldn't forget, a factory worker about the soldier who winked before boarding a secretary about the other girl in the office, whose hand brushed hers in the blackout. These notebooks tucked under mattresses or hidden in biscuit tins never saw the censor's pen. They saw truth in shorthand initials, arrows, tiny hearts drawn in the margins of ration tallies. Historians decades later would stumble upon them like archaeologists finding fossils of fireflies. Packages carried affection in more edible forms. A tin of fruitcake sent overseas tasted like a condensed memory of home sugar and spice surviving the voyage. Soap tucked into a parcel smelled like Sunday mornings. Stockings folded inside whispered more than flirtation. They promised normalcy, glamour, the idea that after the mud, there would still be silk. Some women sent knitted socks, scarves, even gloves, each stitch a syllable of longing, though the soldiers mostly felt only the scratch and warmth. Still, when a pair of socks reached the front line, it was as if the sender's hands had crossed oceans. You meet real figures in these exchanges too. In the U.S., Hollywood stars like Betty Grable send pin-up photos that soldiers tape inside lockers. But the women at home send snapshots of themselves in work overalls, holding wrenches, or babies proving that glamour had many faces. In Britain, a young Princess Elizabeth writes letters to soldiers and serves in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, showing solidarity in words and deeds. In occupied countries, women's letters sometimes smuggle resistance information hidden under innocent phrases. The garden is overgrown, meaning troops are moving each word, carrying double weight. Romance stretches beyond paper. In dance halls, lit dimly for blackouts, women and men sway with urgency, every waltz a small rebellion against sirens. Kisses stolen under railway arches or in factory corners carry the adrenaline of bombs in the distance. Weddings multiply in haste sometimes, with borrowed rings, sometimes with uniforms still dusty from travel, because tomorrow is not guaranteed. The photographs from these ceremonies show brides with simple dresses and grooms with sharp collars, their eyes bright with both hope and fear. Separation makes imagination busy. Lovers keep faith with words, but they also rewrite each other in memory. A smile becomes brighter, a joke becomes sharper. Flaws fade in the fog of distance. Occasionally, the return shatters the illusion, but often it deepens it. The real person stepping off the train, both stranger and familiar, both the letter and the silence between lines. Children born during the war sometimes carry names lifted straight from those letters. Grace Hope, Victor names that remind families that affection survived blackout curtains and censor's ink. The last candle burns low. The ink blot spreads, and you place your pen down gently, as if tucking in the person across the ocean. Tomorrow, the postman will knock again, bicycle bell ringing, and you'll snatch the envelope with the same nervous joy as unwrapping a gift. In the meantime, you fold your longing into neat squares of paper, kiss the edge for luck, and trust that somewhere far away under a tin roof or a canvas tent, another pair of eyes will unfold. It slowly, smile at the smudges, and feel the nearness you tucked between the lines. Boom, the lights die, the sirens whine, and the street plunges into blackout, a city dressed in deliberate darkness. And yet this is where the nightlife begins, not ends. You slip from the shelter with your collar turned up heels, scuffing cobblestones that glisten with yesterday's rain, and your eyes adjust until shapes become invitations. The official order says lights out, but everyone knows human spirits don't run on switchboards. Women learn quickly that shadows can host both danger and escape, and tonight you're walking into a world where dance and defiance share the same beat. The clubs hide behind ordinary doors, their signs painted over curtains thick as secrets. Inside, music shakes dust off the rafters. A gramophone crackles. With jazz in London, a live accordion pulls couples tight in Paris. A saxophone croons somewhere in New York, where sailors flood the floor on brief leave. You sip watery beer or chicory coffee, and it tastes divine simply because it's forbidden fun. Shoes, scuff laughter rises, and someone switches the bulb back on for just a moment before the warden's knock rattles nerves. You spin anyway, because joy in the dark is a rebellion more potent than speeches. Dance halls become confessionals. A woman from the munitions plant still smells faintly of grease. A soldier with dust on his collar sways like the floorboards themselves hold him steady. Words barely matter when the music's loud, so bodies speak. Instead, a hand lingered too long, a smile that glows brighter than the dim bulb overhead. Sometimes the dance is romance, sometimes just release. Either way, when you leave, your pulse is quicker and your step lighter, even if the street outside still feels like the inside of a cave. Hidden bars multiply in basements and bomb shelters. The password is often nothing fancier than knock twice and smile, and the drinks are watered but spirits high. Women mix in, not just as companions, but as singers, bartenders, and organizers of these shadow sanctuaries. In occupied Paris, Josephine Baker herself slips among circles of resistance and cabaret, using her celebrity as both cover and sword-carrying messages in sheet music, and making audiences forget the world's wait for a set. The irony isn't lost on you. Survival sometimes sounds like a love song. Blackout streets teach new rules of flirtation. Without neon signs, without glowing windows, people rely on whispers, footsteps, and the accidental touch of an elbow to guide them. Lovers slip into parks where the trees block searchlights, promises traded under branches, trembling with both wind and fear. Some women find themselves freer in this darkness than daylight ever allowed. Conversations, bolder embraces, quicker social rules blurred by necessity. A modern clubgoer might laugh at curfews and strict entry lists, but would they dare kiss in a city where the sky itself occasionally falls in fire? There's danger woven through the glamour. Wardens, patrol tickets, or issued rumors spread about raids on dens, where soldiers mix too freely with civilians. Yet even in danger, women find agency. They choose where to go, how long to linger, whether to risk the knock on the door for another song. And in these decisions lies a subtle power, the ability to decide pleasure in an age when everything else is rationed. Black markets deal in lipstick as much as meat, and you see why painted lips in a blackout bar shine like lanterns, daring anyone to extinguish them. The spectrum of nightlife stretches wide. In London, underground stations host impromptu sing-alongs, while people wait out the blitz on bunks stacked 3 high. In New York, Harlem clubs draw black and white patrons into jazz-fueled nights that taste like an America still fighting itself while fighting abroad. In Berlin, even under the Nazi grip, clandestine gatherings spark where women and men defy rules about who should love whom, the music muffled, but the spirit loud. The war didn't stop nightlife. It bent it into new shapes, sharper, riskier, yet unforgettable. Gossip travels as fast as music. A whispered rumor in a blackout bar might mean resistance news tomorrow, a soldier's leave extended, or a neighbor's scandal. Women become both messengers and filters, deciding what to repeat, what to bury. That choice, the power to shape the story, is another kind of agency, even if unrecognized. You might chuckle, thinking of today's group chats and social media feeds. Blackout gossip had no emojis, but it lit up conversations just as fast. Every city hums its own soundtrack. In Rome, church bells mix with accordions. In Moscow, balalaikas strum against the chill. In Tokyo, the shamisen threads through curfews. Women in uniform attend these nights too, dancing in boots or in stockings mended twice, swapping stories with strangers whose names they won't recall, but whose laughter they'll remember forever. The war presses down, but the night lifts back. And in that tug of war, you find balance enough to keep going. So when you step back into the blackout, the echo of saxophone still in your ears, you notice the silence is not empty. It's full of memory, the warmth of a hand, the daring of a joke, the music that outshouted bombs for one glorious hour. The streets look quiet, but you carry the rhythm with you, a secret drumbeat, reminding you that even in the darkest nights, women found ways to turn fear into footwork and shadows into stages. The morning after a night of music, the world looks quieter, but no safer. And women wake to another kind of stage, the occupied city where every errand is both ordinary and perilous. You smooth your apron pocket, forged papers, and step out to fetch bread. Except the basket on your arm may conceal false identity cards, a coded letter, or even a crust saved for a neighbor hiding in the attic. The occupation turns daily chores into camouflage, and you become both housekeeper and conspirator, your face calm as your pulse hammers its own Morse code. Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. You hang laundry on a line, and the order of colored sheets becomes a signal to fighters watching from a field. You switch a street sign one night, confusing an enemy convoy and buying partisans hours they desperately need. You stand in line at the butcher and drop a folded slip of paper into another woman's hand while pretending to admire her scarf. A loaf of bread becomes a courier pouch. A child's pram smuggles banned newspapers. A knitting pattern hides code. Remember those hairpins you used to fix machines and disguise notes? They return here too, not as fashion, but as tiny weapons of subversion. Real figures cast long shadows across this hidden stage. In France, Lucy Aubrac arranges her husband's daring escape from Gestapo captivity while carrying her child. Her voice is steady as if she were reading a bedtime story. In the Netherlands, Hannie Schaft, the girl with the red hair, cycles with a satchel of contraband, her freckles glowing fierce under the wind. In Poland, Irina Sendler smuggles Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto in toolboxes and burlap sacks, memorizing each name so none would vanish into numbers. Each of these women wore ordinary coats and ordinary shoes, but carried extraordinary nerve beneath the seams. Courage often dressed as housekeeping. You kneel in the kitchen to scrub a floor, except the tiles lift to reveal a crawl space where two strangers breathe shallowly while patrol boots pass by the window. You serve stew at dinner, except you've stretched the recipe to feed 3 extra mouths hidden upstairs. You host tea with neighbors and speak only of weather, while a radio wrapped in blankets hums faintly in the back room, spitting news from London. The apron strings tie not just around your waist, but around the fate of entire families. Fear is the spice in every breath. A knock at the door rattles more than crockery, and you rehearse answers before opening. Yes, officer. The bread is stale. The children are ill. The husband is at work. Your body learns a new discipline. Hands steady, even when your knees tremble. Voice casual, even when your chest wants to shout. Sometimes, fear is so constant, it becomes background noise like the hum of an electric bulb. The trick isn't to banish it. It's to keep cooking, sewing, sweeping, while fear sits in the corner, like an uninvited guest you refuse to acknowledge. The smallness of acts doesn't mean smallness of risk. Forging papers requires ink stamps, signatures, and nerves of iron. A wrong flourish could mean a firing squad. Hiding a neighbor means ration coupons vanish faster, neighbors whisper louder, and suspicion grows like mold. Yet women did it over and over. In Denmark, fishermen's wives helped ferry Jewish families across to Sweden. In Belgium, school teachers tucked resistance leaflets into children's satchels. In Greece, village women passed messages in bread baked with hollow crusts. Each act a thread. Together, they wove a net strong enough to catch history off guard. You might compare it to modern life, where people repost, retweet, or share petitions with a click bravery measured in keystrokes. Here, bravery meant answering the door with flour-dusted hands, while knowing a false smile might be the only shield between your kitchen and catastrophe. Do you think you would have managed it? Would you have kept your eyes level when a uniform leaned across your threshold? Even humor found a way to serve. Women joked about soldiers who never learned to cue properly, about officers' boots too shiny for cobblestones, about propaganda posters whose slogans sounded hollower than soup pots. A sly quip passed between friends was resistance too, a reminder that fear had not stolen laughter, and laughter, small as it seemed, became a resource as precious as coal or bread. Children sometimes knew more than they let on. A daughter playing hopscotch in the street might call out if strangers approached. A son sent to fetch water might tuck a note into his sleeve. Mothers coached them in silence, in codes, in the art of making danger look like boredom. Survival became a family craft taught alongside sewing and arithmetic. Not every story ended with triumph. Arrests tore through networks, prisons filled, and silence became the only defense left. Yet even in cells, women carved messages into walls, sang lullabies that doubled as signals, and braided resilience into the air itself. Some survived, some didn't, but all left behind a trail of quiet defiance that outlasted uniforms and regimes. So when you lay down at night, apron folded neatly, hands raw from work, you know you've done more than bake or scrub. You've guarded names, passed secrets, kept neighbors alive. Your life might look small from the outside, but history will remember that courage doesn't always wear medals. It often wears flour on its cheek and mud on its shoes, standing at the threshold with a calm smile and a heart that refused to break. You hear the rattle of keys long before you see the gate, and the air grows tight as if even oxygen fears to linger. War does not just reshape streets and ration books. It builds cages, and women step through them sometimes as prisoners, sometimes as witnesses, always as the ones who bear scars history prefers not to examine too closely. You walk into a camp where fences bristle with wire and watchtowers glare with suspicion, and you realize that uniforms here are not for pride but for punishment. The Nazis turned private lives into crimes, and women are swept into prisons not for bombs or broadcasts, but for who they loved, what they whispered, or simply who they were. Paragraph 175 in Germany criminalizes relationships between men, but suspicion stretches beyond, and women accused of asocial behavior, Romani resistors, lesbians, Jews, political dissidents find themselves stamped with colored triangles sewn crudely to striped cloth. Pink for homosexuality, red for politics, yellow for Jewish identity, black for a social green for criminals. Each shape a shorthand that robs individuality, each stitch a weapon. Inside survival becomes an equation solved daily with too little paper and too many variables. Women share crumbs of bread, barter buttons for sips of soup, pass whispered prayers through fences. In Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp north of Berlin, you smell the mix of smoke and despair, but also the stubbornness of those who refuse to let cruelty have the last word. Prisoners smuggle tiny notes, teach each other languages, sew scraps into pockets that hide hope as if hope itself were contraband. Some guard scraps of identity the way you might guard a photograph today. A name repeated, a birthday, remembered, a song hummed under your breath when guards pass. Doctors in white coats conduct experiments without consent, turning women's bodies into unwilling laboratories. You hear accounts of Rabbit's Polish prisoners whose legs were deliberately cut and infected in mock surgeries to test treatments. These women walked or limped out of history carrying scars shaped like deliberate cruelty, yet they carried them with heads unbowed, forming secret support circles inside the camp. They sang together, shared jokes, stole bits of charcoal to mark calendars. Even under the boot of pseudoscience, their humanity survived in fragments that refused to burn. Silence becomes both shield and prison. Some women conceal their identities to survive. Others are betrayed by neighbors, colleagues, even relatives. Yet even in silence, resilience threads itself through. Lesbian women often wore the black triangle of a social rather than pink, an official blind spot that gave them a grim chance at survival, though always under suspicion. They found one another in glances, in work details, in the brush of hands as they passed stones in the quarry. Intimacy did not disappear. It disguised itself, and sometimes it endured. Not all cages carried Nazi insignia. In Allied countries, too, women were surveilled and punished. In Britain, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force dismissed women suspected of immorality, the vague charge often a screen for same-sex relationships. In the U.S., blue discharges expelled service members without honor or benefits for behavior deemed undesirable. The irony burned women trained to drive trucks, decode messages, or ferry planes could be undone by a rumor about who they spent evenings with. Freedom abroad, censure at home, the double bind embroidered into every sleeve. Stories emerge decades later, survivors finally speaking what silence once smothered. A Dutch woman recalls falling in love with her cellmate, their affection hidden under a shared blanket. A Polish partisan describes watching her comrades taken, then returning after the war to find the world uninterested in her grief. In France, resistors who endured camps return and find their medals heavier than their memories, their love stories buried in archives. These voices, once whispers, break into daylight long after the barbed wire has rusted. Comparisons creep in, whether you invite them or not. Think of modern debates about who belongs where, who deserves rights, who carries stigma. Then imagine those debates enforced with boots, dogs, gas. The thought sticks in your throat. What does survival look like under such weight? It looks like a woman at Ravensbrück, tearing a strip of her own dress to bandage another's wound. It looks like a friend refusing to name names under interrogation. It looks like someone carving a flower into a bunk with a nail reminding everyone that beauty can live even in barracks. The cruelty of the camps is undeniable, but so is the resilience. Liberation doesn't erase the nightmares. It merely unlocks the gate. Many women walk out into a world unwilling to hear their stories, some hiding the triangles they wore, some never reclaiming families, some building new ones in silence. Yet the record survives in testimony and diaries, smuggled in scars on bodies and in scars on paper. When you walk through a museum today, glass cases hold striped cloth with triangles, and your reflection overlaps theirs. It is hard to keep your breath steady. So, you leave the prison grounds in imagination, but you carry with you the weight of women who endured cages made of wood wire and shame. They didn't ask for heroism, yet their survival became its own declaration that no regime, however brutal, could erase love's solidarity or the stubborn heartbeat of identity. And maybe that's the final irony. History remembers the symbols stitched in cruelty, but it's the unstitched resilience, the invisible threads of care that lasted longer than the fences ever did. Bang, the victory bell clangs. Papers flutter in the streets. Strangers kiss in Times Square, and confetti rains like history trying to pretend it was always this festive. But you know better, because in the shadows of celebration, women carry stories too heavy to throw into the air. You step out of uniform, out of factory shifts, out of blackout bars, and suddenly the world insists you fit back into the shoes you wore before 1939, as if courage and competence were coats to be checked at the door of peacetime. The men come home, the posters come down, and the whispers begin. Wasn't she, too, forward in uniform? Shouldn't she return to the kitchen now? Factories dismiss women who riveted wings and welded ships, handing them pink slips and polite pats on the back. Governments praise sacrifice but erase detail. Official histories lean on generals, while the women who kept children, fed on cabbage and courage, are footnoted if at all. You're told the war is over, yet the silence that greets you feels like another kind of battle. Some women fight back with ink and memory. Diaries hidden in biscuit tins, surface letters preserved in shoeboxes are reread until the paper grows thin. Memoirs pour from pens decades later. Odette Sansom testifies about her torture and survival, refusing to let the record vanish. Virginia Hall's service earns her the Distinguished Service Cross, though the papers barely print her name. Soviet night witches fly back into obscurity, their biplanes rusting while medals gather dust. And the women of Ravensbrück, who survived medical experiments, stand in courtrooms to stare down doctors in lab coats and demand the world believe them. Their testimony is quieter than parades, but sharper than brass bands. Legacy splinters, but also roots. Post-war feminist movements look back and see ammunition proof that women handled lathes, engines, radios, and parachutes, as well as men, often better. Civil rights advocates note the hypocrisy of segregated units and unequal pay, asking why black women who riveted and nursed for victory cannot claim equality and peace. LGBTQ voices uncover the stories of coded letters, secret dances, forbidden triangles, reclaiming them as heritage rather than shame. The war buried many stories, but it also planted seeds for revolutions yet to come. Silence, though, remains the default. Families often never hear the truth. Children know their mothers were overseas, were busy with war work, but not the details. Husbands assume rationing and housework were the only burdens. Survivors themselves sometimes choose silence because memories sting too sharply, or because society shrugs at details that don't fit its neat narrative of victory. In some kitchens, laughter replaces testimony. In others, silence hangs heavier than the soup pot. Whole generations grow up beside ghosts that never introduce themselves, but every so often, memory slips out sideways. A grandmother teaches a granddaughter to mend a shirt with the precision of a parachute rigger. An old photograph surfaces of a young woman in flight gear, grin brighter than the cockpit behind her. A letter tied with ribbon falls from a trunk ink, faded, but emotion fresh. And suddenly, the family realizes the bedtime storyteller beside them once decoded enemy signals or smuggled leaflets under bread rolls. The secret life becomes not so secret anymore if someone chooses to listen. You think about continuity. How many modern freedoms trace back to those women's hidden shifts? Equal pay debates, childcare policies, women in combat roles, queer rights, movements, threads woven from wartime experiences that refuse to stay buried. Today, when a pilot straps in, when a woman leads a squad, when a protester raises a sign, echoes of Wokui. Women whisper in the background, "We already proved we could." Why did you ever doubt it? History's memory works like a patchwork quilt. Some panels are bright, rosy posters, VE Day kisses, cheerful victory gardens. Others are dark prisons, ration queues, scarred legs of Ravensbrück survivors. And many panels are still hidden in trunks waiting. If you trace the stitches, you see the same thread running through all persistence, ingenuity, humor, love. That's the secret the world almost forgot. Women didn't just endure. They engineered survival-stitched rebellion and carved space where none was offered. So when the parade fades and the uniforms fold into closets, you're left with an inheritance less flashy than medals, but sturdier than monuments. It lives in the recipes still baked, the slang still spoken, the freedom still fought for. It lives in stories whispered across generations and laughter, over teacups in scars traced quietly at night. And maybe the most radical thing you can do now, in the hush before sleep, is remember them not as shadows behind men's battles, but as architects of their own. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear the echo, the hammer in the factory, the typewriter clack at Bletchley, the heartbeat under a nurse's lamp, the pedal of a resistance bicycle, the swing of music in blackout bars. Women in Wabihuai carried secrets not meant for silence. Now that you've heard them, you carry them too.